You trust the map. We all do. When you open your phone or look at a globe or trace a line across an old atlas, you assume you are looking at the truth. It's the most basic data set we have, the ground beneath our feet. If a mountain is drawn on the paper, it has to be there in real life, right? That's what sailors thought 500 years ago. That's what explorers bet their lives on. But they were wrong. Because there is a lie hidden in the archives of history. It's not a small lie. It's not a typo. It is a massive, jagged, imposing mountain range that stretches for thousands of miles across the African continent. It appears on almost every major map from the late 19th century back to the 1700s. Famous cartographers drew it. Kings claimed it. Expeditions were launched to find gold in its peaks. There's just one problem. One terrified, confusing detail that nobody noticed until it was too late. The mountains aren't there. They never were. They are a ghost. A hallucination. And yet, for 200 years, the smartest people on Earth insisted they existed. How does that happen? How do you hallucinate a mountain range the size of the Alps? Most people think history is a solid record of facts. But today, I'm going to show you that history is actually a game of telephone. And somewhere along the line, the signal got corrupted. We are going to trace this error back to the exact second it happened. We are going to find the specific moment of data corrosion where a single mistake infected the entire world's knowledge. And then, we're going to do something they couldn't do back then. We're going to use modern digital analysis to strip away the ink, peel back the corrosion, and reveal what was actually hiding in that blank space on the map. Because the truth isn't just that the mountains were fake. It's why someone wanted them to be real. Stick with me. Because once you see this error, you will never look at a map the same way again. This is the story of the mountains of Kong, and it's the biggest lie in the history of geography. Let's start with the visual. I want you to picture a map of Africa from 1800. It looks mostly familiar. You have the curve of the western coast. You have the Cape of Good Hope down south. But then you look at West Africa, right above the Gulf of Guinea. Running horizontally, like a massive scar across the land, is a mountain range. It's labeled the Mountains of Kong. It looks formidable. On some maps, it's depicted as a solid wall of rock. On others, it's a series of sharp, jagged peaks. According to the geographers of the time, these mountains were the source of the Niger River. They were a barrier that separated the coast from the mysterious interior. They were a fact. If you went to a school in London or Paris in 1840, you learned about the mountains of Kong the same way you learned about the Himalayas. They were in the encyclopedias. They were in the military briefings. Merchants planned trade routes around them. The British government actually worried that these mountains would block their expansion into the interior. They sat in war rooms, pointing at this ridge, debating how to get artillery over the passes. Think about the confidence it takes to plan a war strategy around a geological feature. That is the highest level of data validation. When a government spends money based on a data point, that data point is considered real. But here is where the glitch starts to show. Because people were actually going there. Explorers were sailing down the coast, traders were pushing inland, and they were reporting back. But they weren't saying, hey, there are no mountains. They were saying, we saw them. This is the terrifying part of data corrosion. It doesn't just change the record, it changes perception. When you expect to see something, your brain tries to find it. We have journals from the late 1700s where travelers describe the looming peaks in the distance. They described the blue haze of the Kong Range on the horizon. They were looking at clouds. They were looking at low hills. Or maybe they were just looking at nothing and filling in the blank because the map told them to. It's a psychological phenomenon called confirmation bias, but on a global scale. The map said there was a mountain. So, the explorer looked at the horizon, saw a thunderstorm, and wrote down mountain. That report went back to London. The cartographer in London said, see, I told you, confirmed. And he drew the line darker. He added more detail. He added little shadows to the peaks to give them depth. With every new edition of the map, the lie got sharper. It got more detailed. It became high resolution. And this is a lesson for anyone working with data today. Just because data is high resolution doesn't mean it's accurate. You can have a 4K image of a unicorn. It's still a unicorn. By the mid-19th century, the mountains of Kong were unshakable. They were a defining feature of the continent. But there was a crack forming in the foundation, a tiny hairline fracture in the logic of the world. Because eventually, someone wasn't just going to look from a distance. Eventually, someone was going to try to walk over them. And that is where the collision between data and reality happens. That is the moment the corrosion eats through the hull of the ship. It was a man named Louis Gustave Binger. He wasn't a casual traveler. He was a French officer, a serious explorer. And in 1887, he decided to do the impossible. He was going to map the source of the Niger River, which meant he had to cross the mountains of Kong. He packed his gear. He hired his porters. He prepared for the freezing temperatures of the high altitudes. He studied the maps for years. He knew every peak and valley that had been drawn by the masters in Europe. He marched inland. He walked for weeks. He watched the horizon, waiting for the jagged teeth of the range to appear. He waited for the incline to start. He waited to feel the air get thin. But the ground stayed flat. He kept walking. Still flat. Maybe just a few rolling hills. Nothing higher than a few hundred meters. He checked his coordinates. According to the map, he should be standing on a glacier. He should be scaling a cliff face. But he was walking through tall grass. He was sweating in the heat. There was no wall of rock. There was no barrier. There was nothing. Imagine the feeling in his stomach. This isn't just getting lost. This is reality breaking down. He stood in the middle of the mountains of Kong, and he realized the world was empty. He later wrote about this moment. He said the only thing he found was the horizon. But here's the twist. Here's the thing that makes this a true mystery. Binger wasn't the first person to be there. Others had been in that region. Local traders had lived there for centuries. So, where did the mountains come from? Someone had to start the lie. A map doesn't draw itself. A pen doesn't move by accident. Someone, at some specific point in time, put ink on paper and created a world that didn't exist. Who was it? And more importantly, why? To find the answer, we have to leave the 19th century. We have to go back further. We have to go back to the source of the infection. Because the mountains of Kong were not a mistake. They were a trap. And to understand the trap, we have to look at the man who set it. His name was Mungo Park. Or at least, that's who history blames. But looking at the data, I don't think it was him. I think he was just the first victim. Let's look at the timeline. Because when you lay out the maps chronologically, you see something strange. Before 1790, the maps of that region are mostly blank. They are honest. They say, terra incognita, unknown land. But then, in 1798, a map is published by a man named James Rennell. Rennell is the father of English geography. He is a giant in the field. He is the guy you go to when you want the truth. And on his map, for the very first time, we see the ridge. We see the birth of the monster. But James Rennell didn't go to Africa. He sat in a library in London. He worked with data. He worked with the journals of other explorers. And this is where we find the data corrosion. Rennell was trying to solve a puzzle. He was trying to figure out which way the Niger River flowed. Rivers follow gravity. They flow downhill. So, if the river flowed east, there had to be high ground to the west. Logic dictates it. Physics demands it. So Rennell looked at the blank space on the map. He looked at the flow of the river. And he did what every bad data analyst does. He forced the data to fit his model. He didn't draw what he saw. He drew what had to be there for his theory to work. He invented a mountain range to explain the river. It was a theoretical mountain, a hypothesis. But he didn't label it hypothesis. He drew it in ink. And once it was in ink, it became fact. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that Rennell didn't just make it up out of thin air. He had a source. He had a data set he was relying on. And this is where the story gets dark. Because the data he was using wasn't from a scientist, it wasn't from a geographer, it was from a ghost. A name that appears in the footnotes of history, but rarely in the headlines. To understand the 500-year map lie, we have to find this ghost. Because Rennell didn't act alone. He was fed bad intelligence, and the person who fed it to him knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't an accident, this was a cover-up. But what were they covering up? Why hide a lack of mountains? Usually, you hide things with obscurity. You don't hide nothing with something. Unless that something was guarding a secret. Let's look at the area again. What is behind the mountains of Kong? On the old maps, it's the Gold Coast. It's the rich, resource-heavy interior. If you put a massive, impassable mountain range on a map, you are sending a message to the world. Don't bother. You can't get through. Stay on the coast. Was the mountain range a keep out sign? Was it the first example of geopolitical disinformation? We need to dig deeper into the archives. We need to look at the letters James Rennell was receiving, because hidden in the boring correspondence of the Royal Society, there is a clue. A reference to a white barrier, a mistranslation, or a deliberate distortion. Here is the thing about language. It is the primary vector for data corrosion. If I say the hill is steep and you translate it as the mountain is impassable, the reality shifts. We see this in the logs of the Arab traders who had been in the region for centuries. They called the area Kong. In the local Dayula language, Kong means mountain, but it also simply means height or hill. So when the locals said, "We are going to the Kong," they meant, "We are going to the hills." But the Europeans heard, "We are going to the mountains." And since they were European, and they were used to the Alps and the Pyrenees, mountain meant a 10,000-foot peak covered in snow. They projected their own geography onto a land they had never seen. They heard a word, and they built a citadel around it. This is the semantic drift. One word, translated without context, created a geological feature that stopped empires in their tracks. But if it was just a translation error, why did it last so long? Why did it survive for 100 years? Translation errors usually get fixed when someone checks, but nobody checked. Why? Because the lie was useful. And this is where we get into the psychology of the era. The 19th century was the age of the empty map. European powers were scrambling to fill in the blanks. A blank space on a map was embarrassing. It was a sign of ignorance. It was a weakness. So, cartographers felt pressure to fill it. A map with a mountain range looks complete. A map with a giant white void looks unfinished. They preferred a beautiful lie to an ugly truth. Does that sound familiar? Think about how we treat data today. We prefer a clean graph that shows a clear trend, even if we have to smooth out the outliers. We prefer a definitive answer from an AI, even if the AI is hallucinating. We haven't changed. We just swapped paper maps for digital dashboards. But back to the mountains. Because now we have a culprit. We have James Rennell. We have the semantic drift. We have the pressure of the horror vacui, the fear of empty space. But we still have the mystery of the persistence. Because Binger proved they didn't exist in 1887. He published his findings. He showed the world the empty horizon. The map should have been fixed immediately, right? Wrong. The mountains of Kong stayed on maps for another decade. They appeared in school atlases well into the 1900s. Why? Because of copyright inertia. Map makers were lazy, and they were cheap. It cost a lot of money to engrave a new copper plate for printing. If you wanted to delete a mountain range, you had to scrap the whole plate. You had to pay the engraver again. You had to reprint the stock. So, publishers just didn't. They knew it was wrong. But they kept printing the lie because it was cheaper than the truth. Think about that. Generations of children learned false geography because a publisher didn't want to pay for a new copper plate. It's a brutal lesson in economics. Truth has a cost. Lies are free. But here is where it gets interesting for us. Because we have something they didn't have, we have satellite data, we have topography scans, We can look at that exact region today. And when we switch to the digital terrain view, we see something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Because there is something there. It's not a mountain range, it's not a wall of rock, but it's not nothing. There is a shape in the earth, a ridge, a subtle elevation that follows the exact line of the fake mountains. Is it possible that the map wasn't wrong? Is it possible that the map was just exaggerated? Or is it something stranger? Is it possible that the map was remembering something that used to be there? Geology moves slow, but human memory moves fast. Could the Kong legend be a cultural memory of a much older geological reality? Let's look at the deep history. Let's look at the tectonic plates, and let's look at the climate data from 5,000 years ago. Because the Sahara wasn't always a desert, West Africa didn't always look like this. What if the data corrosion didn't start in 1798? What if it started thousands of years ago? What if the map of 1800 was actually a ghost of a map from 10,000 BC? To find out, we need to run a simulation. We need to peel back the layers of sediment and see what the Earth looked like before the humans started drawing lines on it. And to do that, we need to talk about the Green Sahara. But first, we need to understand what happened to the people who went looking for the mountains. Because Binger wasn't the only one, and some of them didn't come back. They walked into the blank space, looking for a landmark that wasn't there. And without that landmark, they were lost in an ocean of grass. The lie didn't just misinform them, it erased them. This is the physical cost of data corruption. When you navigate by a fake star, you crash. Next, we are going to open the journals of the lost expeditions. We are going to read the final entries of the men who died looking for the mountains of Kong. And we are going to see how long they held on to the lie. How long did they keep walking, telling themselves, it must be just over the next ridge. The map can't be wrong. I must be wrong. That is the most dangerous thought a human can have. The data is right. I am wrong. Let's find out what happens when you follow a ghost off the edge of the world. Imagine being one of those men. You are standing in the middle of what is now Ghana or Ivory Coast. It is 1840. You have a compass in your hand. You have a canteen of water that is running low. And you have a map that says you should be in the shade. You should be in a cool, high-altitude pass. But the sun is hammering down on you. The terrain is flat, endless savanna. Your brain starts to break. You look at the map. It shows the mountains of Kong right here. Latitude 10 degrees north. You check the sun. You check the stars. You are at latitude 10 degrees north. So, where is the mountain? There are only two possibilities. One, the entire world of science, the Royal Geographic Society, the greatest minds of Europe, are all wrong. Two, you are crazy. Most people choose option 2. They doubt their own eyes before they doubt the data. We have fragments of journals from traders and lesser-known explorers who ventured near the Kong region before Binger. They are heartbreaking. They describe wandering in circles. They describe searching for the pass. They weren't lost because they didn't know where they were. They were lost because they knew exactly where they were, but the world didn't match the picture. It's like playing a video game where the level hasn't loaded. You're walking into a wall that shouldn't be there, or falling through a floor that should be solid. One Scottish explorer, Hugh Clapperton, traveled near the region in the 1820s. He noted the absence of the mountains in his private logs. But when he returned, did he scream it from the rooftops? Did he tear down the map in the Royal Society Hall? No, he hedged. He wrote that he did not see them personally, but he assumed they must be further to the west. He moved the ghost. He didn't kill it. Why? Because of authority bias. If James Reynolds says the mountains are there, who is Hugh Clapperton to say they aren't? It's easier to assume you missed them than to assume the expert lied. And so, the mountains survived. They shifted position slightly on the maps. They changed shape, but they stayed. They became a floating fact. A piece of data that isn't anchored to reality, but just floats around the dataset, attaching itself wherever it fits. And while it floated, People planned their lives around it. Missionaries packed heavy wool coats for the alpine climate of the Kong region. They arrived and nearly died of heat stroke. Colonial planners drew borders along the natural barrier of the ridge. When the soldiers arrived to enforce the border, they found no barrier, just open plains where people moved freely. The map created a political conflict that didn't need to exist. Because if there is a mountain range, you don't need a fence. The mountain is the fence. But if there is no mountain and you want a border, you have to build a fence. You have to send troops. The lie on the paper created violence on the ground. This is the stakes of data corrosion. It's not just an academic error, it's a generator of real-world chaos. But let's go back to the patient zero, James Rennell, the man who drew the first definitive line. We need to prosecute him. We need to understand how he did it, because he didn't just guess, he synthesized. He was the big data algorithm of his day. He took inputs from dozens of sources, Arab geographers, ancient Roman texts, rumors from slave traders on the coast, and he combined them. One source mentioned mountains of gold in the interior. Another mentioned a great watershed. Another mentioned the high country. Rennell took these separate, vague data points and fused them into a single, concrete object. He created a composite lie. It's like when police make a composite sketch of a suspect. The nose is from one witness. The eyes are from another. The hair is from a third. The resulting face looks like a real person, but it isn't. It's a monster made of averages. The mountains of Kong were a composite sketch of Africa's geography. They were the average of all the rumors, and because they were an average, they looked convincing. They looked truthy. But there was one specific source that poisoned the well more than any other, a source that Rennell trusted implicitly. We found it in the footnotes of his 1798 memoir. He references the travels of Mungo Park. Mungo Park was a rock star, a young Scottish doctor who went into the dark heart of Africa and came back alive. His book, Travels in the Interior Districts of Africa, was a bestseller. Everyone read it, even the poets. And in that book, Park describes seeing high mountains to the south. He didn't climb them, he didn't map them, he just saw them, or thought he did. But here is the catch. Park was sick. He was suffering from malaria. He was starving. He was being held captive half the time. He was in a state of extreme physical and mental stress. Have you ever been dehydrated? Have you ever had a high fever? The horizon starts to dance. Clouds look like rocks. Shadows look like valleys. Mungo Park, the primary witness for the existence of the mountains, was likely hallucinating. And James Rennell took those fever dreams and turned them into cartography. He took the subjective, biological failure of one man's brain and turned it into the objective, geological truth of the world. That is the moment. That is the click. The corruption didn't happen on the paper. It happened in the retina of a dying man. It happened in the synapses of a feverish brain. And then it was transcribed, encoded, published. And once it was published, it was data. It's terrifying, isn't it? How fragile the truth actually is? But wait, it gets worse. Because Rennell wasn't just relying on Park, he was also relying on something much older. He was relying on the ancients. Ptolemy, the Greek geographer from the 2nd century. Ptolemy had drawn a mountain range in Africa called the Mountains of the Moon. For 1,500 years, scholars tried to find them. Rennell thought, aha, Park found them. These are the Mountains of the Moon. We'll call them Kong. He was trying to validate the past. He wanted the ancients to be right. This is another huge source of data corrosion. Legacy bias. We want our new data to fit our old models. We don't want to throw out 500 years of tradition, so we bend the new facts to fit the old map. Rennell forced the mountains of Kong into existence because he needed to bridge the gap between Mungo Park, the new, and Ptolemy, the old. He was the architect of the bridge, and the bridge was made of paper. Now, let's fast forward again, back to the moment the bridge collapsed. 1889. Binger returns to France. He stands before the Geographical Society of Paris. This is the Super Bowl of geography. The room is full of old men with white beards. The gatekeepers. Binger unrolls his map, and the space where the mountains should be is blank. White space. Imagine the silence in that room. He is telling them that they are all fools. He is telling them that their libraries are full of fiction. He is telling them that the emperor has no clothes and the continent has no mountains. Did they cheer him? Did they give him a medal? Eventually, yes. But at first, there was resistance. There was skepticism. Are you sure, Lieutenant? Maybe you missed them. Maybe it was cloudy. They tried to save the lie. They tried to bargain with reality. Maybe they are smaller than we thought? Maybe they are discontinuous hills? They shrank the mountains on the next map. They didn't delete them. They just made them smaller. They tried to soft-deprecate the error. This is exactly what tech companies do when they have a bug they can't fix. They don't admit it. They just minimize it in the UI. The mountains of Kong went from a wall of rock to a series of hills, to rolling plains over the course of 10 years. It was a slow, painful death. And do you know when they finally, truly disappeared? When did the last map finally show the truth? The mid-20th century. It took 50 years to fully scrub the stain. 50 years of arguments. 50 years of, well, some sources say, that is the half-life of a lie. Data doesn't just get fixed. It has to be fought for. And the fight leaves scars. But here is the part that still haunts me. Binger wiped the mountains off the map. He proved they weren't there. But what if he was wrong too? Not about the mountains, but about the nothing. Because remember what I said earlier about the digital terrain scans? About the ghost shape? I want to show you something. I want you to pull up a modern satellite relief map of West Africa. Look at the line where the mountains of Kong were supposed to be. Latitude 10 north, tracing the line between the basins. It's not a mountain range, but it is a highland plateau, the Joes Plateau, the Guinea Highlands. They are there. They aren't connected. They aren't the Alps, but they are Kong. They are heights. The semantic truth was there. The geological truth was partially there. The lie wasn't that there was nothing. The lie was the connection. Reynold took separate, isolated highlands and connected them with a single line of ink. He turned dots into a line, and that is the most common data error in the world. We see 3 data points, and we draw a straight line through them. We assume the trend. We assume the connection. We assume the narrative. Reynold assumed that because there was a hill here and a hill there must be a mountain range connecting them. He created continuity where there was only chaos. And isn't that what we all do? We try to make sense of the world. We try to connect the dots. But sometimes the dots aren't connected. Sometimes the world is just a mess of isolated facts. And when we try to force a narrative, we create a monster. So, the mountains of Kong are gone. But the Kong effect is everywhere. It's in our history books. It's in our news feeds. It's in our scientific models. Wherever you see a smooth, perfect line connecting 2 distant points, be suspicious. Ask yourself, is the line real, or did someone just draw it because they were afraid of the blank space? But we aren't done yet. Because there is one more twist to the story. One final piece of the puzzle that nobody talks about. The gold. Remember the rumors? Mountains of gold. That's why the traders went there. That's why the empires cared. If the mountains are fake, is the gold fake too? Or did the lie actually hide the treasure? Did the fake mountains accidentally protect a real secret? Because while everyone was looking for the peaks, they were walking right over something else. Something that was buried in the dirt. Something that Binger missed because he was too busy looking at the sky. In the next part, we are going to dig. We are going to look at what is actually under the ground in the Kong region. And we are going to find out that the map makers might have been wrong about the geology, but they were right about the value. The mountains of Kong didn't exist, but the vault of Kong, that might be real, and we're going to open it. Gold. It's the heaviest element in the periodic table of human motivation. It bends light, it bends history, and it definitely bends maps. The reason James Rennell and the European powers were so desperate to believe in the mountains of Kong wasn't just because they liked mountains. It was because of what mountains imply. In geology, mountains are violence. They are tectonic plates smashing together, magma rising, fluids boiling, and that violence creates veins. Veins of quartz, veins of silver, and veins of gold. The logic of the 19th century was simple. If you find the spine of the continent, you find the bank vault. The mountains of Kong were rumored to be the source of the incredible wealth of the Ashanti Empire and the Mali Empire before them. Everyone knew the gold was coming from somewhere. Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali in the 1300s, crashed the economy of Cairo just by passing through, handing out gold bars like they were candy. Europeans remember that. They knew the gold existed. They just didn't know where the mine was. So, when the map makers drew the mountains of Kong, they weren't just drawing topography. They were drawing a treasure map. They placed the mountains right at the headwaters of the rivers where gold dust was being found. X marks the spot. Go to the mountains, they said. That's where the mother lode is. But here is the cosmic irony. The irony that makes you want to laugh and scream at the same time. The mountains were a lie. But the gold? The gold was exactly where they said it was. If you overlay the fake map of the mountains of Kong onto a modern geological survey of West Africa, something incredible happens. The Phantom Range aligns almost perfectly with the Birimian greenstone belts. These are ancient, volcanic rock formations. They aren't mountains anymore. They were eroded down hundreds of millions of years ago. They are now just ridges, hills, and flatlands buried under laterite soil. But deep inside those rocks, it is one of the largest gold reserves on planet Earth. The Obuasi gold mine in Ghana, the Sigiri gold mine in Guinea. They are sitting right in the shadow of the ghost. The map makers were accidentally right about the value, even though they were completely wrong about the shape. It's like pointing at a garage and saying, there is a Ferrari in there. But it's not a garage, it's a basement. You got the location right, you got the asset right. You just hallucinated the architecture. But this brings us to the protection paradox. This is a concept in intelligence analysis where bad data actually secures an asset better than good data, because the mountains of Kong were drawn as a formidable barrier. Impure. Steep. Covered in snow, which is insane for the tropics, but they believed it. The map said, this is hard. You need an army to cross this. You need specialized gear. So, people hesitated. Investors in London didn't fund small, agile mining expeditions. They waited for the big push that never came. The lie of the mountains made the region seem inaccessible. It acted as a psychological force field. If the map had been accurate, if it had shown gentle rolling hills filled with gold dust, the scramble for Africa might have accelerated by 50 years in that region. The exploitation would have been faster, messier, and more brutal earlier on. The Ghost Mountains effectively quarantined the gold. They guarded the vault. It wasn't until Binger wiped the mountains off the map that the real rush could begin. Once the barrier was removed from the mind, the barrier was removed from the land. And suddenly, you see the rise of the colonial mining infrastructure. The railways, the roads, the heavy machinery. They poured into the void that Binger created. It's a chilling thought. We usually think of truth as something that liberates. The truth shall set you free. But in this case, the truth opened the door to plunder. The lie was a shield. The truth was a key. But let's go deeper into the geology for a second, because I want you to understand why the map makers were fooled by the gold specifically. Gold doesn't stay put. It travels. Erosion breaks down the veins in the high ground. Water carries the particles downstream. The gold dust found in the rivers of the coast came from the interior. So, reverse engineering the river meant there had to be high ground. Rennell's logic was sound. River brings gold. River comes from mountain. Therefore, mountain has gold. His mistake wasn't the physics. His mistake was the timescale. He assumed the mountains were there now. But the mountains that created that gold existed 2 billion years ago. He was looking for a corpse, and he drew a living being. He was seeing the ghost of the Ebernian orogeny, a mountain-building event from the Paleo-Proterozoic era. So, in a weird, metaphysical way, the mountains of Kong did exist. They just missed the deadline by 2 billion years. Rennell was a time traveler. He just didn't know it. This connects to a massive problem we have with data today. Lag. We look at a stock chart, or a climate model, or a social trend, and we assume we are seeing the now. But often, we are seeing the downstream effects of something that happened a long time ago. We are seeing the gold dust in the river, and we are drawing a mountain that is already eroded. We build strategies for a world that is already past. The Kong error is a warning. Check your timestamps. Are you mapping the present? Or are you mapping the echo of the past? But while we are talking about echoes, we need to talk about the people who lived in the echo. Because the map wasn't just looked at by Europeans, it was imposed on Africans. Imagine living in a village in the northern Ivory Coast. You know your land. You know it's flat. You know where the wells are. Then a man comes from the coast. He is wearing a uniform. He is holding a piece of paper. And he tells you that you live at the foot of a giant mountain range. You look around, you see nothing. But he insists, it is here. The King of France says it is here. Who wins that argument? The man with the reality or the man with the map? Usually, the map wins. The locals were often forced to guide explorers to passes that didn't exist. Take me to the Kong Mountains. There are no mountains. You are lying. You are hiding the gold. Take me there, or I will shoot. This is the violence of the paper reality. When the data contradicts the ground truth, the powerful actor tries to force the ground to confess. They beat the land until it matches the map. We have reports of guides being punished for losing the way to the mountains. They weren't lost. They were just unable to walk into a fantasy. This is the human cost I mentioned earlier. Data isn't abstract. When you put a line on a map, you are creating a rule for the physical world. And if that rule is wrong, people get hurt. The mountains of Kong weren't just a mistake. They were an instrument of confusion and oppression. They distorted the relationship between the people and their own land. And even today, if you look at the borders of those countries, look at the northern border of Ivory Coast, the border of Burkina Faso. Some of those lines look suspiciously like they were following a ridge that isn't there. We are still living in the house that Rennell built. We are still following the ghost. But now, I want to pivot. We've looked at the geology, the gold. We've looked at the politics, the borders. But there is one area where the mountains of Kong did the most damage. Meteorology. Weather. Because mountains don't just sit there. They make weather, they block wind, they catch rain, they create rain shadows. If you put a massive mountain range in West Africa, you completely change how you think the climate works. Scientists in the 1800s thought the Kong Mountains stopped the hot winds from the Sahara. They thought the coast was wet because the mountains trapped the moisture. This model of the climate was used to plan agriculture. It was used to predict droughts. And it was wrong. Dead wrong. They were trying to predict the weather using a simulation that had a bug in the code. If mountain true, then rained high. But mountain false. So when the droughts came, nobody saw them coming. When the winds shifted, nobody understood why. The climate model of Kong was a disaster. And this leads us to the next part of our investigation. Because there is a theory, a controversial one, that suggests the Kong error actually delayed our understanding of the Sahara Desert by 50 years. It blinded us to the environmental catastrophe that was unfolding. While they were staring at the fake peaks, the desert was creeping south. The sand was moving. And the map said, "Don't worry, the mountains will stop it." The mountains didn't stop it, and the sand kept coming. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the environmental illusion. We are going to see how a fake mountain range hid a very real climate crisis. And we are going to ask, what false barriers are we believing in today that are blinding us to the disasters of tomorrow? It's okay. The seawall will hold. It's okay. The market will correct. It's okay. The mountains will stop the sand. Are we sure? Or are we just looking at another map drawn by a man in a library? Stick around, because the sand is getting deeper. There is a wind in West Africa called the Harmattan. It is dry. It is dusty. It is relentless. It starts in the Sahara Desert and blows south, towards the Atlantic Ocean. In the winter, it turns the sky white. It dries out your skin. It coats everything in a fine layer of red dust. For centuries, the people living on the Guinea coast, in places like modern-day Ghana and Ivory Coast, watched the sky turn white and knew the desert was coming. But the scientists in London and Paris looked at their maps and said, "That's impossible." According to the data, the Harmattan shouldn't be able to reach the coast. Why? Because of the wall. The mountains of Kong were drawn as a solid, continuous ridge, reaching heights of 14,000 feet on some maps. In atmospheric physics, a wall that high creates a barrier effect. It forces air upwards. The air cools, condenses, and falls as rain on the windward side. On the leeward side, the side facing the coast, you should be protected from the harsh winds of the interior. The mountains of Kong were supposed to be the shield of West Africa. They were the reason the coast was lush and green. They were the reason you could grow cocoa and coffee. That was the model. The shield exists. Therefore, the ecosystem is safe. But models are dangerous things when they are built on zombie data, because the farmers on the ground knew the truth. They knew that every January, the dry wind did come. They knew the shield had holes in it. Actually, they knew the shield didn't exist at all. But their knowledge was local knowledge. It wasn't scientific knowledge. And in the hierarchy of the 19th century, a map in a library outranked a farmer in a field. So, when droughts hit, when the cocoa crops failed, the experts were baffled. The mountains should have caught the rain, they argued. The mountains should have blocked the wind. They started inventing complex theories to explain the anomaly. They blamed magnetic fields. They blamed ocean currents. They blamed the moral failings of the local population. They blamed everything except the map. This is a phenomenon called theory-laden observation. Once you have a theory, the mountains exist, every observation you make is filtered through that theory. If the wind blows through the mountains, you don't say, "There are no mountains." You say, "The wind must be incredibly strong to go over the mountains." You adjust the physics to save the geography. This delayed the understanding of West African meteorology by decades. It meant that colonial powers built agricultural systems that were fragile. They planted crops that needed a mountain-protected microclimate in a region that was actually an open plain exposed to the desert winds. And when the plants died, they lost fortunes. The Kong illusion wasn't just a geography error. It was a financial risk model that failed. But let's zoom out, because the sand tells a bigger story. The Harmattan carries dust from the Baudelaire Depression in Chad. It's ancient diatom dust, the skeletons of microscopic lake creatures from thousands of years ago. This dust is rich in phosphorus, and when it blows across the non-existent mountains, it lands in the Amazon rainforest in South America. It fertilizes the Amazon. If the mountains of Kong had been real, if they had been a 14,000-foot wall, they might have blocked that dust. They might have starved the Amazon. The fact that the mountains were a lie is actually a crucial component of the global ecosystem. The void allows the wind to flow. The flow allows the dust to travel. The travel allows the rainforest to breathe. So, in a weird way, the non-existence of the mountains is what keeps the planet alive. But the mapmakers didn't know about phosphorus. They didn't know about the Amazon connection. They were focused on the Sahara. And this brings us to the Green Sahara theory. I mentioned earlier that the map might be a ghost memory. Let's dig into that. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was a savanna. It had lakes. It had hippos. It had people. We have rock art in the middle of the desert depicting swimmers. Then, the climate shifted. The Earth's axis wobbled. The rain stopped. The desert expanded. The people fled south. They fled towards the Kong region. Is it possible that in the oral history of these migrating people, there was a memory of a barrier? Not a mountain of rock, but a barrier of forest. A green wall that separated the dying desert from the living coast. Maybe the Kong wasn't stone. Maybe it was vegetation. Dense, impenetrable rainforest can feel like a mountain when you are trying to walk through it. It blocks the sky. It blocks the path. When the Arab traders asked, "What is down there?" the locals might have said, "A great barrier, a high wall of trees." The traders wrote, "barrier." The Europeans drew mountain. We turned biology into geology. We calcified the forest into stone. This happens all the time in history. We take a metaphor and we make it literal. The Iron Curtain wasn't made of iron. The glass ceiling isn't made of glass. But the mountains of Kong were drawn as granite, and this misinterpretation blinded us to the real threat, desertification. While we were staring at the fake peaks, the desert was eating the forest. The green wall was thinning. The Sahara was marching south at a rate of kilometers per year. If we had had an accurate map, a map that showed the vulnerability of the open plains, we might have noticed the environmental collapse sooner. We might have seen that there was nothing stopping the sand. The map gave us a false sense of security. It told us, "Don't worry, the fortress is holding." But there was no fortress, just grass, and wind, and fire. This is the climate blindness of the bad map. It masks the fragility of the system. Think about our maps today: flood zones, fire zones, sea level rise projections. Are those lines on the map real? Or are they just Kong lines? Are we assuming a seawall will hold because a piece of paper says, "protected zone"? Are we building houses in the path of the Harmattan because a developer told us there was a barrier? The mountains of Kong are a warning from the 19th century to the 21st. Nature doesn't care about your map. Water goes where water wants. Wind goes where wind wants. And if your data says stop and the wind says go, the wind wins. Every time. But the story of the map isn't just about what was wrong. It's about how hard it was to make it right. Because Binger wasn't the only one who tried to kill the monster. There were others. Whistleblowers. Men who saw the truth and tried to speak up. And they were silenced. Not by guns, but by the most powerful force in academia: peer review. In the next part, we are going to look at the politics of correction. We are going to meet the men who tried to delete the mountains before Binger and why the establishment crushed them. We are going to look at the letters that were ignored, the reports that were filed in the trash. Because data corrosion isn't just about the error entering the system, it's about the immune system of the establishment attacking the cure. Why do experts fight to keep a lie alive? Is it pride? Is it money? Or is it the terrifying realization that if this big thing is wrong, what else is wrong? If the biggest mountain range in Africa is a hallucination, is the Nile real? Is the Amazon real? Is the shape of the earth real? To admit the error is to invite chaos. So they held the line. They defended the Phantom Ridge with their reputations, until the reality became impossible to ignore. Let's meet the casualties of the truth war. There is a saying in science: a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. Max Planck said that. He was talking about physics, but he could have been talking about maps. The mountains of Kong didn't survive for 100 years because the evidence was strong. They survived because the men who drew them were powerful. And powerful men hate to be wrong. To understand why the lie lasted so long, we have to look at the machinery of truth in the 19th century. The Royal Geographical Society in London, the Société de Géographie in Paris. These weren't just clubs, they were the arbiters of reality. If they put a stamp on a map, it was true. If they rejected your report, you were a liar. And into this machine walked a man named René Caillier. The year is 1828. Kayilie is a legend. He's the first European to return alive from the fabled city of Timbuktu. He walked across the Sahara. He disguised himself as an Arab. He survived scurvy, thirst, and hostile tribes. He comes back to Paris a hero. But then, he opens his mouth, and the room goes quiet. Because the experts want to hear about gold, they want to hear about giant towers and, implicitly, the great mountain ranges that guard the interior. And Kayilie says, it was just mud. It was a small town, the land was flat, it was dusty. He describes the reality of the Sahel, and the experts are disappointed. They actually attacked his credibility. Some accused him of never having been there. Why? Because his data was boring. And his data contradicted the romantic geography that the establishment had built. The mountains of Kong were part of a narrative of a wild, dramatic, impassable Africa. Kayilie was bringing them data that said, actually, it's mostly open plains and trade routes. He was chipping away at the fantasy, and the establishment reacted like an immune system attacking a virus. They marginalized him, they questioned his notes, they preferred the exciting lie to the boring truth. This is a critical concept in data analysis called the narrative fallacy. We love stories. We love drama. A map with a giant mountain range is dramatic. It implies adventure. It implies challenge. A map of flat grassland is dull. So, when a whistleblower like Kayilie comes along and tries to flatten the curve, the human brain resists. We want the mountain to be there. This resistance created a silent spiral. Other explorers saw what Kayilie went through. They saw the bringing back negative data, i.e., I didn't see anything, was a career killer. To get funding for your next expedition, you needed to promise big discoveries. You needed to promise, I will find the source of the river. I will cross the great peaks. If you wrote a grant proposal that said, I suspect the map is wrong and there is actually nothing there, you didn't get the money. The funding structure itself incentivized the lie. It paid for confirmation, not correction. Does that sound familiar? Think about modern research grants. Think about corporate reporting. Who gets the budget? The person who promises revolutionary growth? Or the person who says, I think our projections are inflated and we should expect a flat year? The mountains of Kong were the revolutionary growth of Victorian geography, and nobody wanted to be the bearer of bad news. But the cracks were spreading. In the 1850s, a German explorer named Heinrich Barth traveled through the region. He was meticulous, a scientist. He crossed the Niger River. He moved through areas where the eastern edge of the Kong Mountains was supposed to be, and he noted gaps. He didn't scream, fake. He was too polite for that. But he started erasing sections of the range on his own maps. He turned the solid wall into broken hills. He was the soft corrector. He tried to fix the data without offending the original authors. He compromised. Maybe the mountains aren't everywhere, his maps suggested. Maybe they are just here and here. This is the bargaining phase of data correction. The establishment looked at Barth's maps and said, okay, fine, we will make the mountains a little smaller. But we're keeping the name. They refused to delete the entry. They just modified the attributes. It's like admitting a scandal, but refusing to resign. I made a mistake, but I'm still the expert. The mountains of Kong remained on the official maps of the British War Office well into the 1880s. Think about that date, 1880. The telephone had been invented. The light bulb was being developed. We were entering the modern age. And yet, our map of the world still had a medieval dragon on it. It took the absolute, undeniable proof of Louis Gustave Binger to finally kill it. And why was Binger different? Why did he succeed where Kayilie and Barth failed? 2 reasons. 1, he was a soldier, not just a scholar. He had the backing of the French military, which was actively trying to colonize the area. The military doesn't care about romantic geography. They care about, can I march a column of troops from point A to point B? If the map says mountain and the troops hit swamp, the general gets angry. The military demand for operational truth overpowered the academic demand for theoretical truth. Utility killed the fantasy. And 2. Technology. Binger had better instruments. He had better chronometers. He could track his longitude and latitude with a precision that Rennell couldn't argue with. He didn't just say, "I didn't see it." He said, "I walked along the 10th parallel for 500 kilometers, and the elevation never exceeded 600 meters. Here is the data log." He brought a spreadsheet to a poetry reading, and the data won. But the victory was slow. Even after Binger, the ghost lag continued. Textbooks are expensive to reprint. Teachers are stubborn. I learned it this way, so I will teach it this way. It took another full generation for the knowledge to filter down from the situation room to the classroom. There were children in 1905 learning about the mountains of Kong while their fathers were stationed in West Africa sending letters home saying, "It's flat here." The disconnect between the center of knowledge and the edge of reality was total. And this brings us to the ultimate question of the politics of correction. Who owns the map? Is it the person who draws it or the person who walks it? For 500 years, the map belonged to the drawer. The mountains of Kong are the monument to that era. The era where authority W reality. But Binger flipped the script. He ushered in the era of ground truthing. The idea that a single data point from the field can overthrow 1,000 theories from the capital. It was the democratization of data. But have we kept it? Or have we slid back? Today, we rely on algorithms we don't understand. We rely on black box models. If Google Maps tells you to turn left into a lake, some people turn left because the screen says so. The authority of the screen has replaced the authority of the paper. We haven't cured the disease, we just changed the medium. But we still have one more layer to peel back. We have talked about the geography, the gold, the weather, and the politics. But we haven't talked about the void. When you take a mountain range off a map, what do you put in its place? You create a vacuum. And vacuums are dangerous. Because when Binger erased the Kong Mountains, he didn't just correct a map. He opened the door to the scramble for Africa. He removed the psychological barrier that was keeping the colonial powers on the coast. No mountains, no problem. Let's go. The correction of the data led directly to the acceleration of the conquest. It's the dark side of truth. The lie kept the colonizers out, mostly. The truth invited them in. In the next part, we are going to look at the weaponization of the void, how the blank space on the new map became a battlefield, and we are going to look at the modern digital reconstruction. We are going to take the ghost data of the Kong Mountains and feed it into a modern 3D terrain generator. We are going to see what the world would look like if they were real. We are going to visualize the alternate timeline, because sometimes to understand the truth, you have to simulate the lie. Let's fire up the render engine. The year is 1890. The mountains of Kong are officially dead. Binger has fired the kill shot. The map is blank, and almost immediately, the weaponization of the void begins. While the geographers were mourning the loss of their beautiful peaks, the generals were celebrating. Because blank space on a map means maneuver space on the ground. If there are no mountains, there are no choke points. There are no ambushes in narrow passes. There is just a highway of grass. The French military realized this first. They looked at the new, empty map and saw a straight line from the coast to the interior. They launched the Mission Voulet-Chanoine. They launched the columns that would conquer the Sahel. The Kong Gap became the invasion route. The lie had acted as a psychological dam. When the dam broke, the colonial floodwater poured through. History accelerated. The fall of the Wassoulou Empire, the capture of Timbuktu, the subjugation of the Ashanti hinterlands. It all happened in the blink of an eye after the mountains vanished. Geographic knowledge is military power, and the correction of the data was the ultimate weapon. But now, I want to step away from the history books. I want to step into the lab. Because we have a unique opportunity here. We have a data set, the 1840 map of the mountains of Kong, that describes a world that almost existed. What if we took that data and treated it as real? What if we fed the Kong parameters into a modern supercomputer running a climate and civilization simulation? Let's build the Kong world. I want you to visualize this. We are entering the parameters: latitude 10 degrees north, length 800 kilometers, elevation average 3,000 meters, comparable to the Pyrenees, Mulmys, peaks up to 4,000 meters, snow-capped. We hit run. The simulation generates a new version of West Africa, and it looks completely different. First, the weather. In the Kong world, the Harmattan wind hits the north face of the mountains and stops. The dust from the Beaudelet Depression piles up on the northern slopes, creating massive dunes. But south of the wall, the coast of Ghana and Ivory Coast isn't just tropical. It is hyper-humid. The mountains trap the Atlantic monsoon. The rainfall triples. The rainforest isn't just a strip along the coast. It is a dense, impenetrable jungle that stretches all the way to the foot of the mountains. It creates an Amazon of Africa. Second, the rivers. In our world, the Niger River does a weird loop. It flows north into the desert, then curves back south. It's called the Niger Bend. But in the simulation, the mountains block that flow. The water pools in the north. It creates a massive inland sea, a mega lake, in what is today Mali. Timbuktu isn't a desert port, it's a lakeside metropolis. Third, the people. In our world, the absence of barriers meant that trade, religion, and armies moved freely. Islam spread south. Gold moved north. But in the Kong world, the mountains are a wall. The cultures on the coast develop in total isolation from the cultures of the interior. The Ashanti Kingdom in the south becomes a fortress civilization, protected by the jungle and the peaks. They likely never get conquered by the British in the 19th century. You can't drag artillery through a hyper-jungle and over a snow-capped range. The Kong world is a world of strong, isolated empires. It is a world where the scramble for Africa hits a brick wall. The history of the last 150 years doesn't happen. Or it happens very, very differently. When you look at this simulation, you realize something profound. The map makers of the 19th century weren't just drawing a mistake. They were drawing a wish. They were drawing a Europe-shaped Africa. They wanted mountains because they understood mountains. They wanted clear borders because they understood nations. They wanted a world that played by their rules. But the real Africa, the Africa of flat savannas, shifting deserts, and seasonal rivers, was fluid. It didn't fit their rigid, mountain-based logic. So they rejected reality and substituted their own. This is the cognitive dissonance of the 500-year lie. The map was a psychological defense mechanism against a geography they couldn't comprehend. But let's bring it back to the present. Why does this matter to you, sitting at your desk today? Because we are doing it again, right now. We are building digital twins of our world. We are mapping the metaverse. We are mapping the economy. We are mapping the social graph. And we are introducing Kong mountains into the code. We are hard-coding assumptions that don't exist. Users behave rationally. The mountain, markets are efficient. The mountain, viruses don't cross borders. The mountain, we build our models on these rigid, comfortable assumptions. And then, when the Harmattan blows, when the crash happens, when the disruption hits, we are shocked. But the model said we were safe. The model said there was a barrier. The Kong error is the original sin of data modeling. It is the belief that the map is the territory, and the only way to fix it is to walk. To do what Binger did. To get out of the simulation. To get out of the office. And walk the ground. You have to verify the zero. Finding nothing is just as important as finding something. Binger's genius wasn't that he found a new mountain. It's that he had the courage to report the emptiness. How many of us have the courage to report nothing to our bosses? I looked for the trend, and it's not there. I looked for the ROI, and it's zero. That is the hardest data to deliver, because it feels like failure. But it is actually the highest form of truth. Binger didn't fail. He liberated the map from a lie. He gave the world the gift of the void. And in that void, the real history could finally begin. But the story isn't over, because a lie that big leaves a mark. Even after the mountains were erased, the names remained. There are still places in West Africa today that bear the name Kong. The Kong Empire was real, a political entity, not a geological one. The town of Kong exists. The map makers heard the name of a town and stretched it into a continent spanning range. They took a point and made it a line. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the legacy of the line. We are going to trace how the fake mountains influenced the modern borders of nations, how the colonial powers, even after knowing the mountains were fake, still used the ghost line to divide up the land. We will draw the border where the mountains used to be. It sounds insane, but it happened. The mountains are gone. But the scar they left on the political map of Africa is still there. We are going to trace that scar, and we are going to find the final, lingering piece of the mystery. A piece that connects the mountains of Kong to a modern-day UFO conspiracy? Yes, you heard that right. The Kong anomaly has a strange afterlife on the internet, and it involves satellite glitches, government cover-ups, and the refusal of the human mind to let a good mystery die. The ghost is haunting the servers now. Let's go find it. Ghosts don't just haunt old houses. They haunt servers. They haunt code. And they haunt the strange, dark corners of the internet where data goes to die or to be reborn as conspiracy. The mountains of Kong were officially erased from the British War Office maps in 1891. But you can't erase an idea. Once a shape has been in the collective consciousness for 100 years, it leaves a residue. And in the digital age, that residue has turned into a glitch. If you go to certain digital map archives, or look at the raw metadata of older satellite compilations, you sometimes see artifacts, ghost pixels, elevation data that doesn't match the photograph. In 1999, a digital mapping project for a flight simulator game accidentally reintroduced the mountains of Kong. Why? Because they were using public domain map data that had been digitized from, you guessed it, 19th century sources. The algorithm didn't know the mountains were fake. It just saw lines on a scan and converted them into 3D terrain. For a brief moment, on a server in a gaming company, the mountains of Kong rose again. Players were flying virtual jets into a mountain range that hadn't existed for a century. This is data zombieism. Old, dead data gets scraped, aggregated, and fed into new systems. And because modern systems are so complex, nobody checks the source. We assume the data lake is clean, but the data lake is full of old tires and rusty bicycles, and sometimes a rusty bicycle looks like a mountain. But it gets weirder, because the human brain hates a vacuum. Remember the horror vacui, the fear of empty space? It's still here. There are online communities forums dedicated to hidden history and mud floods, where people debate the existence of the Kong Mountains today. They look at the old maps, they look at the new maps, and they don't say, the old maps were wrong. They say, the new maps are hiding something. Why did they erase the mountains? What are they covering up? Did they flatten the range with directed energy weapons? I wish I was joking. But this is the inevitable end state of data corrosion. When trust in institutions collapses, every correction looks like a cover-up. Binger's heroic journey to find the truth is reinterpreted as a government operation to hide the truth. The nothing he found becomes the redacted. The void becomes the secret base. This is why this story matters. It's not just about a mountain, it's about the fragility of consensus reality. If you let a lie sit on the map for too long, it becomes part of the bedrock of belief. And when you try to jackhammer it out, you crack the foundation. People would rather believe in a massive conspiracy than believe that a guy named James Rennell made a mistake in 1798. A mistake is boring. A conspiracy is exciting. And the internet runs on excitement. But let's step back from the fringe. Let's look at the legacy of the line in the real world, the political world. I told you that the mountains influenced the borders. Let's look at the map of West Africa again. Look at the northern border of Ghana, the northern border of Ivory Coast. They are straight lines, ruler lines, drawn by diplomats in Berlin in 1885. When they drew those lines, they were looking at the Kong map. They were thinking, okay, France gets the north side of the mountains, Britain gets the south side. The mountains will be the natural border. Then the mountains vanished, but the line stayed. The treaty had been signed. The ink was dry. You can't just redraw a border because the geography changed. That starts wars. So, the nations of West Africa are today divided by a ghost. There are villages that are cut in half by a line that was supposed to follow a ridge. Cousins live in different countries, separated by a phantom peak. The political reality of millions of people is dictated by the hallucination of a dead cartographer. This is the inertia of the error. Once a decision is made based on bad data, the decision creates its own gravity. It becomes expensive to undo. So, we live with it. We build our world around the mistake. We pave the road that follows the cow path that followed the ghost. And we call it history. But there is one final layer to this archaeological dig. We have found the source, Renel. We have found the cure, Binger. We have found the cost, the lost expeditions, the borders. But we haven't found the meaning. Why do we keep falling for it? Why do we keep drawing mountains where there are none? Because the mountains of Kong are the perfect mirror. They reflect what we want to see. To the explorers, they were glory. To the kings, they were gold. To the geographers, they were order. To the conspiracy theorists, they are mystery. The mountain wasn't made of rock. It was made of desire. And as long as we desire the world to be more exciting, more ordered, or more mysterious than it actually is, we will keep drawing them. We will keep finding patterns in the noise. We will keep seeing faces on Mars. We will keep seeing trends in the random walk of the stock market. The mountains of Kong are inside us. They are the geography of the human mind. So, how do we stop it? How do we break the cycle of data corrosion? We have to learn to love the null result. We have to learn to celebrate the blank map. We have to teach our children and our algorithms that, I don't know, is a valid answer. That a white space is better than a fake mountain. Because the white space is honest. The white space is potential. The white space is an invitation to go and look. The fake mountain is a command to stay away. Binger didn't just find nothing, he found the future. He found the space where the real Africa could be mapped. And that is the job of the explorer, not to invent dragons, but to slay them, to clear the fog, to wipe the lens, and to say, look, it's empty. Isn't that beautiful? But wait, I told you there was a payoff. I told you we would reconstruct the truth. We know the mountains aren't there. We know the gold is there. But there is one thing we missed. One thing Binger missed. Because he was looking at the ground, he should have been looking at the sky. Modern satellite archaeology has found something else in the Kong region. Something circular. Something huge. The Bosumtwi crater. It's a meteorite impact crater, 10 kilometers wide. 1.07 million years old. It's in the Ashanti region, right near the gold belts. When the meteor hit, it shattered the crust. It melted the rock. It created a localized geological anomaly. Could the legend of the Kong have started with a memory of a falling star? A mountain of fire that fell from the sky? The locals call the lake in the crater sacred. They say it is the resting place of souls. Maybe the Arab traders heard mountain of spirit and wrote mountain of rock. Maybe the error wasn't visual, it was spiritual. We were trying to map a feeling with a ruler, and that never works. The mountains of Kong were a spiritual truth that got crushed into a physical lie. And now that we know that, we can finally let them go. We can let the ghost rest. We can look at the map of Africa, trace the line of the Niger River, and see it for what it is. A beautiful, complex, flowing reality. Uninterrupted. unbroken, and entirely real. This has been the story of the 500-year map lie. The story of how we broke the world to make it fit on a piece of paper, and how we are still trying to put the pieces back together. I'm the ancient enigma, and remember, check your sources. Question the map, and never be afraid of the blank space. That's where the truth lives.